In this lecture today, on the course on United Nations and the world peace, we would discuss neocolonialism and the role of United Nations. What United Nations has done to address this issue of neocolonialism, which relates to the former colonies which gained independence and they remained underdeveloped. And it is said that because of exploitative mechanism which the developed nations use to keep them underdeveloped. So this is going to be the subject of our talk today, and I hope that this discussion on neocolonialism, and especially in this matter, the role of United Nations will help us to understand that what kind of the economic system we have around and how the former colonies which have gained independence continue to remain, continue to face the economic exploitation. Dear students, I welcome you. I'm Iqbalur Rahman. I teach political science in the Department of Political Science of Aligarh Muslim University. Neocolonialism, dear students, refers to the economic and political control of developing nations by developed nations through means other than direct control. Colonies were directly controlled, and today the developing nations are controlled indirectly. That refers to the situation which is described as neocolonialism. This process has its roots in the 19th century when European powers began to colonize and exploit the countries of Africa, Asia, and Americas. The exploitation of resources and labor in these colonies led to the development of the colonizer nations and the underdevelopment of the colonized nation. This is the serious issue. And UN, right from the very beginnings, has taken up this as its primary responsibility to address this question of underdevelopment of the developing nations, the global south. One of the principal objectives, as we know, that of the United Nations is to solve economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian issues through international cooperation, my dear students. We know quite well that the primary duty is collective security, maintenance of international peace and security. Besides this role, the other role in which we see that the UN is extensively involved is economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian issues which it attempts to address, resolve through international cooperation. United Nations does this through a very comprehensive system which has evolved over a period of time in the context of the situations as and when they became the concern of the people of this world. This consists of the funds, programs, specialized agencies, and the related agencies, etc. Human role in this field particularly is the responsibility of the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. According to the UN Charter, this agency, this organ of the United Nations shoulders the responsibility to address these issue of economic development. It was designed to play the coordinating role in relation to the specialized agencies. In practice, the ECOSOC, dear student, was not allowed to develop according to the purpose which charter has assigned for it. How it happened, what we see in reality is that the Bretton Woods institution, the post-war institutions which were created to address the economic reconstruction of the Europe, particularly after the Second World War, the institutions of International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created. Right from their creation, they dominate the international financial system and play a determining role in setting the economic framework for the global economy. What we see is that the needs and the views of the developing nations, the global south, do not matter for them. They even play a key role in setting the agenda of domestic economic policy for the developing nations, which are reliant on their financial support. And most of the developing nations are reliant, they depend upon the financial support from these institutions. They are the specialized, dear students, they are the specialized agencies of the United Nations. What are they? They are legally part of the United Nations system, but they work independently. They do not report to the UN. UN has no control over them. They are not accountable to the United Nations. Their agenda is set by G7, developed nations, IMF, World Bank works for the developed nations, and especially in the context of IMF is said that it is the gatekeeper of the United States of America. For example, this will give you a picture where you can relate the IMF, International Monetary Fund, to the role which it plays. The United States holds so many votes in the IMF that it has an effective veto over any of the IMF policy decision which involves interventions in economically stricken countries, which are generally belong to the developing nations. What is of significance here, dear student, is that they are the masters and the developing world is their client. Developing world is the client. They are the masters. They are the lenders. They provide the funds. So we are the clients and we have to take loans from them. These institutions, dear students, are accused of participating in neocolonialism by making loans and other economic aid that are conditional on the recipient countries taking steps favorable to those represented by these institutions, but detrimental to their own economies. The conditionality, dear student, is the requirement of the International Monetary Fund, which is a source of debate. Conditionality here means that the loan, the lending which is given by the IMF, it is attached with the condition. Sometimes they are referred as structural adjustment program. These conditions which are attached to the IMF lending programs, dear students, cover a variety of issues from physical and monetary reform to economic liberalization and institutional change. These are the conditions which are laid down, which are attached to the loans that the developing nations, whosoever, if it receives the fund, it has to face these kind of the conditionalities. Otherwise, the funds are not available to them. The IMF provides the conditional loans to the states with austerity measures and spending restrictions. Spending is restricted, but an economic professor in the New York University, William Sterling, explains in an interview that there remain obvious parallels between the colonial era and the IMF model. What he is explaining that there is obvious parallel between the colonial era and the IMF model. It resembles with the old colonial setup, which is in different way continuing after the decolonization. Countries on the brink of defaulting often have no option, dear students, but to turn to the world lender as a last resort, raising concern of whether the decision to enter a stringent agreement with the IMF is a decision at all. They have no options. They have to seek loan, and the loan is conditioned, and that becomes problematic. The public investment reductions, mass layoffs, and lowered labor regulations increased Latin American countries' capacities to pay off their debts and exposed them to globalized free trade. And this case is not only limited to the Latin American countries. The same is true in case of Africa, in case of Asia, the entire global south. However, the notion of neocolonialism sheds light on what in this system and constellation of power represents the continuity between the present and the past. The past colonial system and the present neo-colonial setup. United Nations, right from the very beginning, as I said in the beginning of this lecture, that it has been involved and it has taken a leading role in promoting development, particularly in the global south. The issue of neo-colonialism has been addressed by the United Nations and other international organizations through different means. Several relevant resolutions are in place to prevent the exploitation of the developing nations from neo-colonialism. We refer here some of the resolutions adopted by the United Nations, but we also have to understand right here that the United Nations General Assembly resolutions, recommendations, they are not legally binding on the members of the United Nations. They are of recommendatory nature. The General Assembly resolution 1514, number 15, on the declaration of the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples, which was adopted in December 14, 1960, is one action which United Nations has taken. This resolution affirms the right of all the peoples to self determination and condemned colonialism in all its forms. The other resolution adopted by General Assembly 2625 number 25 on on the declaration on principles of international law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, which was adopted on October 24, 1970. This resolution reaffirms the principles of 1960 resolution and calls for the elimination of all forms of colonialism. The other resolution, the resolution on definition of aggression, adopted by General Assembly on December 14, 1974. This resolution defines aggression as, among other things, the use of economic and political pressure to control the government of sovereign states. United Nations prohibits the use of force, and it clearly talks of use of force, military use of force, but it also includes that political and economic pressure, use of political tools, economic tools to exploit the states which have gained independence. They have become independent. Through this resolution, it makes it clear to us, to the developed nation, that this use of economic and political pressure is not legally valid, not justiciable. So, neocolonialism, exploitation through use of these kind of mechanisms, UN clearly prohibits. The other guiding principle, the United Nations guiding principle on business and human rights, it was adopted, which it was endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011. The principles of this guide us how businesses can respect human rights in their operations and supply chains and can help prevent the exploitation of developing nations by multinational corporations. Multinational corporations are the agencies which are described as the agencies which exploit the developing nations, and they become the tools of neocolonialism. So, Human Rights Council endorsed the United Nations guiding principles of business and human rights, whereby it protects that rights of the people in the supply chains and rights of the people have to be prevented, and the exploitation of the developing nations by multinational corporations has to stop. This action of the United Nations prohibits the use of multinational corporations to act as the tools of exploitation of the developing nations. The other action which United Nations has undertaken, it is the United Nations declarations on the rights of indigenous people, which the General Assembly adopted in 2007. This declaration affirms indigenous people's right to self-determination and to protect their lands and cultures and resources. The further United Nations, the action which has taken, this is the United Nations framework and guiding principles on land governance, which the General Assembly endorsed in 2012. These principles guide how to ensure the responsible governance of land and natural resources and can help prevent the exploitation of the developing nations by developed nations and multinational corporations. The United Nations, dear students, has taken several action in recent years to address the issue of neocolonialism in its member state. Some examples include the United Nations Development Programme UNDP, founded in 1958, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development UNCTAD, established in 1964, have been working to support the development of sustainable and inclusive economies in developing nations. This includes providing technical assistance and capacity building support to help these nations overcome the negative impacts of neocolonialism. Other than these two institutions, the United Nations Environment Program has been working to promote sustainable development and protect the environment in developing nations. This includes providing technical assistance and capacity building to support to help these nations overcome the negative impacts of neo-colonialism on the environment. The United Nations Environment Program is addressing the question of neo-colonialism, economic development, through the protection of environment. The other actions which the United Nations has undertaken of late of United Nations for Economic Development, which we can refer here as Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals. Millennium Development Goals were adopted by the UNGA in 2000. Millennium Development Goals were a set of 8 international development goals aimed at addressing key social and economic challenges facing the world's poorest countries by 2015. The Millennium Development Goals, which are popularly called as MDGs, focus on eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, promoting gender equality, reducing child, improving maternal health, combating HIV and AIDS, malaria and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and developing global partnership for development. While progress was made in this regard in many areas, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, faced criticism for their narrow focus and lack of inclusivity in the development agenda. The other program United Nations is working these days is Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Building on the momentum of MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the General Assembly in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. 2030 is the line which General Assembly has set for the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs consist of 17 goals and 169 targets addressing a broader range of economic, social, and environmental issues with the aim of achieving sustainable development for all by the deadline 2030. Unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals recognize the interconnectedness of various development challenges and prioritize the integration of economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. The SDGs cover a wide range of issues, including poverty eradication, health, education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and a strong institution and partnership for the goals. So, Sustainable Development Goals is a larger program on which the United Nations, through the cooperation of its members, is working towards the implementation, realization of these goals. Let us hope that by the end of 2030, something credible will come out of it. The United Nations role, it is beyond doubt that the UN is involved in addressing the issue of economic development, in addressing the issue of exploitation by developed nations of developing nations through different kinds of mechanisms, through conditionalities which they attach to their loans, through the conditions which they lay down when they provide assistance, economic assistance, the investment which they make, they are also not free, and they are not necessarily beneficial for the countries where the investment is made by the developed nations. Point here is that United Nations is the organization of states, and the General Assembly's role, as I made, is specific to you in the course of the discussion on this lecture today, that the recommendations, the resolutions which are made by the General Assembly, they are not legally binding on its members. Despite this limitation, what we see, dear student, that the United Nations General Assembly, the United Nations altogether, through its system of governance, through its mechanism which it has developed, it is trying to address the question of economic development. It is trying to end the exploitation of developing nations, the states of global south, and majority of them were colonies in the past. They have become independent. They are legally sovereign, but in matters of economy, they face that their economy is not actually in their hands. It is controlled by outside forces, which are developed nations, and it is determined by them, their institutions which they have created. The fact of the situation is this, and the United Nations on its own, means the kind of the authority which it has, it is trying to address this question, and it has achieved success, but that success is not of the kind where we can say that this inequality in matters of economy, the inequality in matters of developing nations and the developed nation in other areas is not there. It is there and it continues to exist. But the fact of the situation is that the United Nations is the agency which attempts to address. United Nations is the agency which attempts to resolve this question of neocolonialism, this question of underdevelopment of developing nations, and the reasons which are identified, the problems which are put across. The United Nations takes it up and tries to address it. So, thank you.